Hey Rico, and welcome back. It's time for our next feedback session, and this time you have started on your block out for your character that you're going to be working on for the rest of the term here. And I am going to be going through this, talking about our fundamentals as well as answering some of your questions, and I think we'll probably do that first before we get started. I did notice one thing here, though, I wanted to point out to you just to make sure that you were aware of it, just a very small thing. For your legs, I believe this is the only subtool that has this turned on, but the smooth modifier is unchecked. I just wanted to point that out. Essentially what that modifier does is if that is unchecked, when you go to subdivide that, it will not smooth out. So you can see how that is not smoothing out. So I'll undo that. I'll turn that back on for you. And now when you subdivide that, you can see how the geometry is getting smooth. So just a very, very, very tiny thing, but I didn't want you to get confused if you were going to work on your legs later and you experienced a problem like that. This is all default down here in the geometry palette. You can pretty much never mess with this. I occasionally turn this off if I'm working on some hard surface stuff that I want to get some more geometry on. But that's all. Let's go ahead and jump right in. We won't waste any time here. Looking at your quick questions and comments here, I'm really happy to see that you are making some good progress. And it sounds like you're happy with your progress as well, which is awesome. So I'm very happy to hear that. Let's go ahead and look at your first question here, which was about the character's breasts being squeezed together in the reference image. Okay, I see. So your problem is with mirroring them and the geometry getting stuck together. So you have your sphere, and it is crossing the x-axis, so that means that when you perform a mirror and weld operation, which is what I assume you are doing, you are getting your geometry fusing together in the middle, and that is causing some issues. So that is a very simple thing to fix. I often use the mirror and weld function as well, which, just to make sure that you know where that is, it's under Modify Topology, and mirror and weld, it's somewhere in here. There it is, right at the top. So just to make sure you know where that is, and I believe that is what you were using though. So the way that you can get around that, there are a couple ways. The way that I like to do on occasion is to just duplicate my subtool and then just run a mirror operation on that, which is down in the deformation palette. Don't ask me why it's down here and not up with mirror and weld, or why they're not together. That's just kind of the way it was done. So that is in the deformation palette. And then you have two of those, and you could maybe merge those together if you want, or keep them separate, or it could just be something that you leave there and toggle on and off to maybe check how things are going. And you can kind of duplicate that and mirror it again if you need to. Another very quick way, probably the faster way that I prefer to do, is up in the Z plugin menu under, what would it be, under Subtool Master. Here we go. There are a bunch of different operations in here, but the one that you are looking for is just mirror, so just click on that. There are a couple different options here. Merge into one subtool, and x-axis is what we are looking for, so we'll just click OK. And just like that, we have the two objects that are mirroring across the x-axis, and as you can see, they are not welded together for the geometry. So that is what I would recommend. I'll leave that as that is for now, and we'll come back to those in terms of shape language and everything else. But let's go through the rest of your questions here, and just let me know, not just on this, but on anything that I talk about. If I go a little too fast or if I'm unclear, feel free to ask any questions after our session. The next question you had down here on your list is about the knees and keeping them separated. But you don't feel like the elbow needs to be separated. Awesome, awesome. No worries. So this actually kind of ties a little bit into your question about Dynamesh and merging geometry together. So I think you're probably at a good point where you could start doing that for a lot of your pieces of geometry to kind of simplify and start working on larger shapes. So the reason why I block out in kind of this kind of piecemeal style where I take a bunch of different subtools, kind of like what you've done here, and start splitting them up, is just because in the earlier stages it's easier to work with a little bit more of a focused attention on, let's say, the upper leg, and then you can focus a little bit on the lower leg, etc., right? But I would say you're probably at a good point where you could start merging some of these together, and we can just go ahead and use the merge down function here to start merging a couple of those together. And just like that, we are all set to run a Dynamesh. So the form here is, I would say, very simple. So I don't think we need a whole lot going on here. If we look at the silhouette, we have this line flowing down the leg, right? And then right here, at this point, we have a little bit of a hit and a break as it starts to turn into the knee. So it's a little hard for me to do this at this kind of awkward angle here. But that is the basic situation that we are looking at. So a little bit of a dip in, and then a pull out right there at the knee. So we'll just kind of puzzle piece that back in. So that is what we want from kind of this, a little bit of a 3/4 angle for this leg. This one's a little bit more straight on, but essentially we'd be looking at it like so. So that means that we want to use our move brush or something similar and maybe just pull out a little bit there and work on the flow of those shapes. So because we have a lot of stuff going on here, what I'm going to do is just run a simple Dynamesh. So I'll just go ahead and toggle that on, and I'm getting some pretty low-res geometry, a lot lower than I would expect for this high of a Dynamesh. And that's actually because of the scale of your 3D model. So I have imported another very simple block out that I was working on for about an hour yesterday, just kind of playing around with some shape language. Very, very rough, very simple, but I'm just going to hit Shift-S to drop that on my canvas and switch to your object. And you can see that there's this very large discrepancy in the sizes of these two characters. So the way we want to correct that, and actually to take a step back, the reason why we want to correct that is because all of ZBrush's main tools work best at a size of 2 units cubed. So we want to try to get as much of your character as we can around that scale. So a way you can kind of quickly check that if you have some weird stuff going on is you can just click on your tool menu and click on an object, and hey, you got a large sphere, but your entire character is about the size of that sphere. So I would say that's probably something that we would want to scale up to make it a little bit easier to work with. You don't have to do this, but I think it will be easier for you in general. So what I recommend is in the Z plugin menu under Transpose Master, just click on T-Pose Mesh. This will take all of your subtools and combine them into one singular object here. I believe we looked at this in our last feedback session, so you are probably familiar with this tool. And from there, all I'm going to do is in the size menu, I'm just going to take this and scale it up a little bit. Let's say maybe around 8 or so units tall, because then I can see that a lot of this is just quite a bit closer to what I'm looking for in terms of scale. So what I would expect for how my tools would work at this size. I think you'll have a lot easier time working with Dynamesh, especially once you do a similar change like this. So we'll just go ahead and T-pose back very quickly. It'll scale everything up for us, and we can go ahead and move on from there into looking at our legs now with an actual Dynamesh. So I'll just Dynamesh those together, and there we go. We got that all set up. I am going to, I think, just take our geometry here. Looks like we got a little bit of stretching there. Let me undo just to see what's going on. So we got a little bit of a floater down there. That's no problem. What I'll do is I'll just, select or deselect some of that geometry and run a delete hidden operation. So the delete hidden operation is under geometry, modify topology, delete hidden. Essentially, you can hold Control and Shift to activate any of your selection brushes like the select rectangle or select lasso, which is what I prefer to use. And then after you hide some of that geometry, you can just run delete hidden and it's gone forever, and we can re-Dynamesh and that'll close holes and everything else, so we don't have to do a bunch of different operations there all at once. From there, I'll press Control W just to make sure we have one solid polygroup here. And I'm going to do one more operation before we run a Z-remesh, and we'll look at Z-remesh and why that is great out here in a moment as well. We will use the mask lasso with the control key held down. So we'll grab that mask lasso, control, click, and drag right around there, right around the knee region, and press Control W. So with that mask, that'll create two different polygroups. And now I'm going to Z-remesh with keep groups to hopefully get us something a bit more clean. But it looks like Z-remesh is maybe having some issues here. So I'll go down into Z-remesher. And okay, I see. So you have the same button checked. So I will deselect that. Typically when Z-remeshing, our objective is to lower the poly count. So I would never want to do something that would be quite as high as 50K, right? Which your geometry was quite a bit lower poly count than that. So I typically try to avoid a lot of these operations so that I can get something a bit more specific in terms of poly count here. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to lower this all the way down as low as it'll go to 0.1. And I will just go ahead and click on Z-remesh and let that run its course. Oh, you know what? Let me hit escape really quick and turn on keep groups, because that's why we created the little poly group there. And then that should give us a nice little poly group separation between the upper and lower leg. Now this little poly group separation, what I'm going to do with that edge loop is actually use that for the point that I was mentioning before, where that kind of sticks out a little bit there. So if we press the D key, we can kind of see how that smooths out the geometry. Already we have something pretty clean going on here, but we're not quite on shape exactly, so there's quite a few things that we could do here to switch this up. But I think we will maybe look at that in just a moment after I answer, I think, what is your final question. I know you had a couple other questions about Z-remesher and Dynamesh and when to swap between the two of those. Hopefully that video I sent you was helpful in kind of enlightening for a few of the different cases in which you could probably utilize some of those tools. If not, feel free to send me any of your questions on that, but I see that you had another question that I wanted to answer on clay tubes and clay buildup. So we will talk about major shape changes here in just a moment, but let me look at that really quick here and swap here to a couple brushes. Let's see, we'll grab the clay buildup and the clay tubes. And I'll just zoom in here on a piece of geometry. I'll just add in a couple subdivs, and let's go ahead and get sculpting. So the clay tubes first is a very nice brush. I believe that you said, if I remember correctly, that you prefer the clay tubes. Or no, I believe you said you prefer the clay buildup, actually. So they are very similar brushes, but there is kind of one key difference between the two of them. The clay tubes brush has a limit to how high it can build up and how low it can build your geometry down in one singular stroke. So if I were to use the clay tubes brush on this and push as hard as I can with my pen and just keep sculpting over top of that over and over and over again, it only builds up so high. And that is determined by, I believe, your depth or embed slider here. They're the same thing. So you can mess with those to adjust the settings there. You can also just use your sensitivity with your pen to work with adjusting that, or lower your Z intensity. Your Z intensity will be a key factor in that as well. And then the clay buildup brush does pretty much the same thing, but it allows you to build that geometry up forever. So I can just sit here in the same spot and continue to build up, build up, build up, build up forever and ever, or carve in, carve in, carve in, right? So that is the main key difference. I would say, in terms of which I prefer to use, I actually have my own clay brush that has a little bit more of a clean texture. It is similar to these brushes, but it's just a little bit more clean, and it's something that I built a while ago and I just kind of prefer to use. My clay brush is more similar to a clay tubes brush in the fact that you can only build up so far. I would say that both brushes are very nice. I prefer using the clay buildup when I am using Sculptress Pro because it's a little bit faster. And I prefer the clay tubes brush just kind of in general simply because I can have more control with it. So I think both brushes are viable. I don't think that one is necessarily better than the other. I think it just kind of comes down to preference and what you are kind of needing the tool for. If you're just trying to block out some stuff really quick and be a little bit more messy, I think clay buildup is a little bit better for that. If you're maybe a little bit further along in the process and you are trying to have a little bit more control, maybe the clay tubes could be a little bit more useful for something like that. But at the end of the day, like I said, I think it just kind of comes down to preference. But that is kind of a quick breakdown on those two tools. So from here, I believe that's all of your questions covered. So we will just go ahead and continue on here taking a look at a few of your major proportions. So we'll do that first, and then we'll talk about some of the other small things, and I'll point out some fundamentals here as well. Awesome. So I think the first thing I want to do here is just grab your image, scale that up, and turn down the opacity somewhere around there. And then I'm just going to line up your character's head here to check on a couple proportions. So we'll just kind of line that up. I just wanted to see a couple areas here. Let me just that opacity a little bit more and just look at a few different areas. So I think just because of the twist of the body, right, we can't necessarily get that perfectly lined up the way we would like. So it's going to be a little tough to align some of this stuff. But I think for the most part, in terms of proportional height, I think you're in a pretty good place. I think that some of our shapes are incorrect, though, which is not a difficult thing to fix. So we will mainly be looking at that. And let's go ahead and turn that all the way back up, please. There we go. And scale that down just a little bit. So the first thing I want to do is work on your character's head just a little bit here. So I am going to adjust some of the proportions up here, and I am going to get rid of all of the kind of secondary shapes, such as your eye cavity and your nose, just a little bit, just because they're a little distracting at this stage, and we really want to focus in on major shapes as much as we can. So I am just going to use a few different tools here. Most of the stuff that I'm using, you are quite familiar with. I don't think I'm using any new tools here. I'm just kind of using the move brush right now and looking at our reference for the shape of your character's head. And I will go ahead and push in a little bit on the head here. You also asked, I know, about the trim brushes. I have my own trim brush that I like to use, and it is quite similar to a trim dynamic brush. It's a little bit more gentle and controlled, though, kind of similar to my personal clay brush. I like to use that a lot for just kind of planing out shapes. For instance, the side of the character's head right here. We'll just adjust some of that. I think that our front or shelf of our skull, the front part of the face there, is just sticking out a little bit too far. Feels a little bit too elongated. Oh, whoops, turn that back on. So we'll just adjust that ever so slightly. And we'll just make sure that we're looking at as many different angles as we can to see how this is shaping up. Now for the jaw line, I typically like to just kind of clean this up a little bit, get something a bit more planed out on the bottom. Once we connect the neck and head together, we'll transition between these a bit more cleanly later on, but for now, I think what you have for the most part is perfectly fine. Let's go ahead and take a look here. So that nose is pretty far up on her face. Let me see here. You have a couple subdivision levels here, which is fine. I will just temporarily dynamesh those out and take a look at a couple other areas here. Looking at her brow ridge, mainly just trying to get the main hits and breaks of the face, following this line around here. There's a little bit of a separation between the shading there that helps to tell us a little bit more about the shape. That's shape or plane change that is happening. That's quite helpful. And I would say we could clean up the back of the head there just a little bit more too. Just to kind of keep everything a little more consistent. This is a newer brush. I'm not sure if I've used this in the first feedback session or not. It is essentially a pinch brush and a dam standard brush combined. It's what's known as a mech cut brush. There are a lot of different versions of mech cut brushes. A pinch brush is totally fine to use though, as a good substitute. The only reason I use that is I was hoping that it would push this in a little bit more than it actually did, which it did not, which is fine. I'll just use my move brush and manually adjust that. And I am just looking at the jawline, kind of flowing down there, which I think is pretty close. One way that we can really check that, though, to get a better idea is by adding in a quick little ear or two to our character to make sure that that is looking pretty good. So let's do that next. I will just append a sphere, and we'll find out where that sphere went. There are a couple different ways to go about doing something like this, but we'll just append a quick sphere and scale it down. We could, of course, use something like the Insert Multi-Mesh Primitive brush, but we'll just kind of do this so we have it as a separate subtool already. And with a quick little squash and a quick little move over, let's use our move brush to get an idea of where that needs to sit. And actually just inserting that there lets me see a couple inconsistencies in the jawline, which is totally fine. I'll just tuck this back corner of the jaw a little bit more, because that tends to help taper the face a little bit nicer. And our ear does not need to stick out quite that much, although her ears are sticking out quite a bit from what I can tell, and they're pretty low on her face. So what I'm looking for is this straight line down, what we have here with the side of the face, and then another straight line to the jaw. So looking at your character and what we have right now, the jawline is just not quite steep enough of an angle from what we can tell. So we need that to be, I mean, that looks almost like a 45-degree angle. She has a little bit of a tilt going on with her head, so that's not going to be quite as accurate as we would want. But let's go ahead and Z-remesh this down just to make it a little easier to manipulate. 1K is probably way more than we would need, so we'll just maybe cut that in half or so. We'll do a quick mask with my favorite mask tool, the mask lasso, and with the transpose line we can use the rotate function or maybe the move function to slide that up. You can see that it's causing some other issues there with stretching and squashing just because of my mask, so I'll just stick with the move brush for now. We'll kind of push that up and take another look at how our silhouette is shaping up. So pretty much a 1-2 is what we're looking for, so straight down and then down to the chin. So we'll make sure that we are representing that as best as we can from the front, and then we'll have to try to use all of our fundamentals to make that work from the profile and back view as well. Let's make sure that that ear is lining up nicely. I don't really want to do too much more to this to give it any additional shape, so just some quick little tweaks there to make it actually look a little bit more ear-like. And the top of that seems to be about at the eye, so somewhere around there. We can adjust that later on, but I would say that that is starting to feel much closer in terms of proportions. There's definitely a lot sharper transitions and shapes happening here, but for the most part, we can work on that into refinement later on. Mainly what we're looking for here is just to get that silhouette matching as much as we possibly can. And I think we are in a much better place. There's obviously a lot more that we can do here to continue working on this, but that is starting to feel much more clean and on par for what we are looking at with the shape language in your character over here. So we'll just continue on down the body here into the neck. I think the neck feels pretty good in terms of length, but looking at the thickness here, she has pretty much a twig neck, so I think I'll just adjust that a little bit and probably, rotate that a little bit more forward just to make sure that the balance of that or where that would connect feels a bit better. It felt a little bit stiff and off balance. We want to try to avoid parallels if at all possible, if you remember that being one of our fundamentals. That also means that we want to avoid shapes being parallel with our central world axes. And what I mean by that is that if we have like a neck or a torso, for instance, we don't want those shapes sticking directly up or directly to the side or directly forward and back with the z-axis, because that tends to make things feel really stiff and awkward. Whereas in this case, just a simple rotation starts to make that feel, I think, a lot better. Maybe a couple more adjustments to the profile of the neck. I don't want to sit here on the neck for too long, though, because there's a lot more that we want to look at. So I think we'll just continue on down to the rest of the body. Don't forget that there is a little bit of a trapezius here, so it's not just the neck going straight down. I can see that you have flared that out a little bit. Instead of flaring out the neck, though, I would maybe instead flare up from the back, like so. Just because anatomically, this is what we would expect, as the trapezius muscle does indeed connect all the way back here to your scapulas and run down about halfway down the back to, say, about... Whoop, got some subdivisions there. Say about somewhere around here. Now, this is not an anatomical study by any means, but just knowing some of the anatomical forms can be very helpful in placing some of your objects. So just be aware of that. Looking at your back as well, it starts to curve in a little bit too early. So looking at this shape here, as that edge starts to turn in. So we would like to kind of widen this out quite a bit, I think. And let me just kind of pinch here so I can see what's going on with your planes. If anything, the front of the torso is more narrow than the back, just because of the large muscular form of the, as I mentioned, the trapezius. And I think, off the top of my head, I cannot remember the name of the, I want to say infraspinatus, but I'll do a quick little search here just to make sure I'm getting the term correctly. That's right. The infraspinatus is an internal muscle for the scapula, so that sits very close to the teres major and minor around here. But what we're mainly looking for here is just the main bulk of the latissimus. So that is not something that you need to know or even worry about, but it does help in terms of just understanding the width of the actual back of your character. So I will go ahead and work on that. And I'm going to toggle off polypaint. I thought that those were connected, so no worries there. Just kind of widening that out. And looking at the actual torso, let's toggle off the breasts. That is not the breasts, that is the butt. We will toggle off the breast there and take a look at the actual torso. So for the shape here, the breasts tend to sit right above the rib cage, which we can see a little bit of some lines indicating some of that form. There's not a whole lot going on there though, so we will have to be a little bit more creative with our form. This is just getting, I think, a little bit too messy and a little bit too deep overall. We want to be really careful with the depth of our torso, as the torso is quite thin in general, about a third of the depth as it is wide. Whereas this is feeling a bit more boxy, it's feeling a bit more too proportionally similar. So we will make that a little less wide, and especially for this character, she appears to be quite thin. So that is something that we will look at here. And I will just fill in some of this so that we don't get too weird of a Dynamesh. There. Let Dynamesh do its thing. And I'll just clean that up so that we don't get any super weird results from ZRemesher. And I will scroll on down here to ZRemesher, and we'll just set this to around like 0.5 or so. Honestly, we could go much lower than that, but for what we're working with here, I think that's totally fine. And I will just adjust your little shape transition here for the rib cage of the character. And with a little bit more smoothing and cleaning up, as she really doesn't have too much form going on here, but we can see the curve of the body about here to the rib cage line. It's a little bit lower. It's more so right about here is what I'm looking at. That's where the surface starts turning and widening back out, so we get that hourglass figure. So we'll just kind of clean up some of this and maybe get rid of the concavity that we were seeing there. Let's also thin this out quite a lot. So that was done with the transpose master, or I'm sorry, the transpose line. I simply used the move operation, which you can use to squash and stretch. So that's what I've done there. I'm also going to toggle off your arms so that I can see what's going on here with our back a little bit better. And we'll say about right there. Let's move that little hit ever so slightly. And for the torso, we'll just make sure that that is all lining up nice and neat. In terms of additional kind of secondary form, you have a little bit of some dip-in stuff going on here. I would try to just kind of keep this nice and clean for now. If anything, maybe the major form transition of the abdominal muscles, just a little bit of a hit there. But for the most part, keeping that nice and simplified is, I think, probably smart right now. And then, as I mentioned, you could probably start combining a lot of this stuff together. So let's see what we got going on down here. I am going to combine your, well, pretty much everything here for your torso, just to make it easier to work with. So let me make sure we have all of this stuff here. I'll just merge all that together. Awesome. And then with a quick another Dynamesh, we have all that. We even have some polygroups here that we could utilize with Dynamesh, or I'm sorry, ZRemesher, to get some nice clean separations between those objects. And I actually think that I will do that. I think that sounds really nice. Nice and easy to work with. So I will kind of clean this up really quick here. And I am going to just kind of smooth out a lot of this form. As the butt is a little bit too low, we would expect this to be a little bit higher up and connected to this form. That's why from the front view it starts to feel a little bit kind of like we have an extra pair of legs sticking out there. So a little bit of some extra cleanup there. And let's do a ZRemesh, our good tried and true keep groups ZRemesh. And with the 0.5 settings, we should be totally fine. So there we go. We're starting to get something nice and clean. We even have some nice clean polygroup separations there. Let's start adjusting some of this through here. Have a nice clean separation there. Now we do have the actual hit of the hips of the character. So if we're looking at that 3/4 point, what we're looking at is right here. Right there on the hips. Let me turn these hands off real quick. Right there. There's a little bit of a sharper transition. That just means that this needs to move forward a little bit more. So we have the actual hips. It's the iliac crest there sticking out. It's that bony landmark. Try to find as many of those bony landmarks as you can. And for the butt here, I am just going to smooth out a lot of this and start to widen that out like so. Now, if you are going to have a large butt on a character, you need to have large legs to support it. That just makes common sense, right? And if you're going to have some small, scrawny legs here, you're going to have probably a smaller butt as well. We can't really see too much of what's going on there, but we can get a lot of information from the silhouette of our character. So looking at this line flowing up, there's not too much extra meat sticking out there. So that's something that we would want to pay attention to and look at. But as we as you progress on this character and start to merge more and more geometry together, it will become much more apparent once you start paying attention a little bit more to that silhouette. So you can see that I'm starting to get like a little bit of a dip in here. It'd be much easier to kind of clean up that separation once we merge the legs and the body together. But in terms of actually running a line down here, what I typically like to do is just a simple line all the way down the back, like so. This actually helps me to work on splitting some of the form up here anatomically for some of the forms that we were talking about earlier, like the trapezius. And then down here you can work on splitting and separating out this form as well for the butt. Pretty simple stuff in terms of just shape. It's very, very simple right now, very clean. But that is mainly what we are looking for. I think that's starting to feel much more close to what I'm seeing happening in the silhouette of our reference over here. And then maybe, another thing that I like to do on occasion is just run a little bit of a pinch around the rib cage. The sword here is actually covering it up, but it looks like there might be a little bit of a form transition there. Very hard to tell. That is what I am seeing happening there. So just a little bit of a plane change. And then, of course, we would also want a little bit of a plane change up towards the top of the ribs for the clavicles. And just a simple line for the time being will be more than enough to represent that form change. Whoops. Just a little bit of a smooth and clean up there. And I think we're in a pretty good spot to continue on here. I think this line is probably a little bit too sharp. So I'll just kind of round out some of the torso there. Maybe get a little bit extra form here. The main thing, as you kind of question, what you should be working here, just roll on back to your silhouette, take another look at that curve, and try to line that up as best as you can. We're looking at the back here as that wraps down and around. So that's feeling much closer to me overall in terms of the shapes happening in the torso. So we can go ahead and move on down to your legs. We'll look at the main line of the body, and then we'll look at the arms as well. So for the legs, we already made quite a few changes down here in terms of just combining that geometry and using Z-remesher to create a little bit of a cleaner separation. But we can add some subdivision levels here. We could just work with dynamic smooth. One thing that I occasionally like to do with the Z modeler brush is with a jointed area, this works great for the arms as well, right around the elbow, is that you could run. So grab the Z modeler brush, hover over an edge loop, hold the space bar, click on bevel, and all this will be default, edge loop complete, all that stuff. And just click and drag a little bit. We'll do something like right about there. That looks pretty good. So now when I smooth that out, the transition there is a little bit tighter. And you know what? I think we might want it a little more tight than what we have, but for now, that's looking pretty good in terms of just general form change. And I think overall that's feeling really nice. Looking at the overall character, I think the legs are a little bit too long proportionally. I know we can't see the full length of the leg, but just looking at from this point, from here to the hip to the knee, I think we're just a little bit too long here. So what I'm going to do is just shrink that ever so slightly, say about right there. Of course, we'll need to move your feet up too and get that to a better place. From the profile, I will just adjust your legs ever so slightly, looking at some of the major shape language here. Mainly what I'm looking at is information like straights and curves, but I'm not just making this form change up off the top of my head. I'm actually looking at your character's legs. So that inner leg actually has a little bit more of a curve towards the bottom portion of the upper leg there. So with the move back face masking brush, we can kind of pull that out towards the middle. So you can see up here towards the hip, it's a little bit of an offset in where this major curve happens. So a little bit more out here towards the bottom and then up and in, a little bit more out here towards the top on the outside and then flowing down into the knee. So a little bit out here, a little bit more in there. Creates a nice little dichotomy in that curve, and I think it works really well with the shape that you already had there. So very few changes to kind of get that into a really nice clean place. Can't see the lower legs too much, so I think what we'll do is probably mirror just as much of the shape language that we have in your character already, and I think you've done a pretty good job with the shapes in the legs. I would say maybe just a little bit more here to kind of balance that out with some of the straights and curves stuff that we're looking at around here. So that is where our fundamentals really come into play to help us out. We use as much as we can from the silhouette of our character to inform as much of the decision-making process as we possibly can. And then where we have some blanks or some areas where we can't exactly see what's going on, that is where our fundamentals really come into play and help us out. So let's move on here to your arms as well, and we'll start making some changes there. Just looking at your profile of your character, I think the weight balance is actually feeling pretty good. I think a few of the changes here to the legs helped in that. It looks like the line here is a little bit warbly, which is fine. That's very, very easy to clean up here. So what I'll do is I'll just use the move brush. And you know what? I think I'll give a little bit more volume there to the back of the leg. A little bit more volume to the back up top as well. I just want to straighten out the lower leg ever so slightly from the profile because it's feeling just a little bit too off balance. And I think that is feeling a little bit better. The only other thing is that now she feels like she's leaning forward because of those changes, so I'll just straighten out the leg here. That was probably a little bit too much. Let me take a look there. That. You know what? I think that's feeling pretty good. A couple other changes here that will help to make our character feel a little bit more on balance as well. Okay, let's finish up here with the arms, and then we'll look at the breasts really quick as well. All right, so for your arms, you've created this nice little transitional deltoid shape. I'm actually going to toggle that off because I don't think it's actually doing us any favors right now. I think it's maybe getting a little bit in the way of what I'm seeing happening here. Instead, what I would like to do is focus on this shape right here, which is this really sharp kind of transition from the neck kind of rolling out to the torso, to the end and pulling down the arm. So it creates this really sharp shape. So let's just make sure that we have that first, and then maybe we can worry about some secondary pieces there. So right about there, we can see that sharp little point happening on the outside as well. The upper arm seems to be quite a bit larger as that transitions down. What I think that is more so the trapezius, or I'm sorry, the trapezius, the tricep back here. I'm all over the place with my anatomical terms today. We'll get the tricep a little bit more large, and I think the front of the arm could use just a little bit more volume as well. Now, we don't want to get too anatomically heavy here, right? Because really what we're seeing is pretty void of anatomical form. More so what we're looking at is just the silhouette of that shape. And overall, I think that's feeling much better. But just looking at this, I can tell that it is a little bit squashed. Make sure that you're looking at your shapes from those major major views that you don't really get to look at a shape very often from, so like top down and bottom up, to get an idea of the volume of your shape. So we're just a little bit too squashed there, so I will just go ahead and round out that shape a little bit. And because of those changes, we do get a little bit too thick towards the bottom there. So all I did there was use my mask lasso to separate the bottom, and then with the transpose line, with move selected, you can run an inflate or a deflate by right-clicking that outer circle and pulling in or out. So that's how I did that very quickly. The deflate slider is down here in your deformation palette, though, if you want to play around with that. And after a couple more tweaks there, that should be good. Let's go ahead and merge some of this information together for your upper and lower arm. And let's go ahead and just do that now. Let's make sure I have all the parts here. Awesome, they're all right here. Together with a Dynamesh. Beautiful. And you know what I'm gonna do? Oh, here, let me polygroup that with Control W, and then I'll mask and polygroup that all together. Use our tried and true Z-remesher with keep groups turned on. And I think that'll put us in a pretty good place with the arm. I think you just have a little bit too much additional form happening around this area, around the elbow, and that's just causing a little bit of awkwardness there. Not a huge deal, pretty easy to fix. So just kind of work on that for a little bit. The forearm is a little bit more thin than what we'd want, I think. I'm going to lower the poly count there even more. We just have too much going on. And I'm going to use that Bevel Z-Modeler brush, Bevel Edge Loop. It's the exact same thing that we did down here on the knees, if you remember that. Up here on the elbow, start to work on that. And I'm just going to adjust the width and the angle of this shape. You can see how that line interacts there a little bit better. And continue to adjust that shape. And just paying attention to our silhouette, looking at our fundamentals, especially straights versus curves and tapered shapes are something that we want to pay attention to in our character's limbs. So always keep that in the back of your mind. Looks like the forearm's a bit more flat here in the front and a bit more rounded up through here, which is what we would expect anatomically. Forearms are quite complicated in terms of anatomical form, but I think the artist has done here a pretty good job of representing such a complicated shape in such a simple way. So I like what they have going on there. And a few more tweaks and changes there. And we're starting to feel quite a bit better. I think, just looking at length, the arms do feel quite long. Let's see. Typically, you want your character to be able to have their wrist line up with their crotch if you were to rotate it down. And you'd want their elbow to align with their belly button. I think the main issue here is that our forearm is just a tad too long, which is not a difficult thing to fix. And you know what? I think our forearm is maybe just a little bit too long as well. So just a few adjustments there on length. And then I would say in terms of block out, I would be pretty happy. Whoops. Need symmetry on there. I'd be pretty happy with this stage and be ready to move on into refining my shapes even more. But in terms of just a kind of a low poly, simple shaped block out, I would say, like I said, that this is a pretty good place to kind of move forward on from here. So what I am going to do is I am going to save this out for you to use for a reference. If you would like to use this and build off of it, that is up to you. I would personally recommend that you use the information that we went over today and the model as more of a reference as what you could kind of build towards and kind of help you out for specific things. So I know that here at the end, it's kind of tough to see exactly what's happening for every single part and piece. But I would say that this is what I would try to get to in terms of accuracy before moving on into refining your character a little bit more. If you've already kind of moved on to that stage, no worries. I would say just use this as a good way to start focusing more on those simple silhouetted shapes that we see going on here. But other than that, just making sure that there's nothing else that's really sticking out to me. I think the head of the character feels actually a little bit too small, which is a very easy thing to correct with a very simple scale up. And I think the only other thing we didn't really look at was the feet. I would say that these are going to end up being a pretty simple kind of oval shape, probably pretty similar to what we have going on here, but maybe a little bit longer and more thin. Unfortunately, because we don't have those present, there's not a lot of information that we have to go off of those. So I would say kind of work on that basic shoe shape as you move on into refinement with everything else, and that'll put you in a pretty good place. But yeah, other than that, Rico, you have a great rest of your day. Of course, let me know if you have any questions on anything that we covered. Until next time, I look forward to seeing and reviewing your character's refinement. You have a great day.